Medal of Honor, Stories of Courage, Season 2, J.R. Martinez. I have to tell you, I spent 8.5 years in the Naval Submarine Service. So thank you for your service. And more importantly, thank you for what you're doing to inspire, motivate, and raise awareness to what these men and women in these podcasts have dealt with and continue to deal with. What have you learned from this process of doing these weekly episodes?
Well, first and foremost, Jim, thank you so much for having me on. And I want to say real quick, thank you for your service. But I equally want to replace those 5 words with another 5 words that I think all of us should try to replace. Instead of just simply saying thank you for your service, I would encourage people to say, when you encounter a veteran, tell me about your service. And so I know that we're limited with time here, and so, you and I can connect offline, but I would love people to start to really, when they encounter a service member, to ask them to tell me about your service. And I think what that does, that allows a service member to, when it gives them the microphone and it gives them the space to say, am I ready to share? Am I comfortable sharing? And then as they start to share, maybe, oh, you know what? Maybe, okay, that person that asked me that question, they're a little bit more open to the things that I've experienced. All right, maybe I'm going to start sharing more. And that's part of the healing process, is the more that we could talk about these things, the more that we can get these things out, the more that we can have people listening to us. But I think that when you simply just say, thank you for your service, it just ends with a period. That's it. It's just done. Where do you go from there? And so just really getting people to say, hey, tell me about your service. I'd love to know what you did. Tell me about that. What does that mean? What does that we always got these fancy titles in the military about the profession that we do. And you're like, what is that? There's all these numbers and letters associated to our MOS, our jobs. And you're like, I don't understand what that is. But to your question in regards to Medal of Honor Stories of Courage podcast that I have the honor of hosting season 2, it's as someone who kind of believes to be a little bit of a nerd about his history and loves to unpack and lean in on all these things that have happened over the course of our history and our world. But specifically, when it comes to our military, you hear about Medal of Honor recipients and the things that they did in that moment or in some cases, there's a couple of people that actually got 2 Medal of Honors, which we do unpack in season 2. And Dan Daly, which you definitely want to make sure you listen to this story. This man was a legend. But essentially, you start to hear about these heroic acts and you're like, man, these people are just so grand in what they did. And the reality is, when you listen to the story, when you get to know these individuals, you realize the things that they were exposed to prior to that military service, prior to that moment, were kind of ordinary things that we're all exposed to. They're kind of ordinary people. But the thing that along the way that they buy into this concept of service. They buy into this concept of purpose. They buy into this element of, it's like this selfless act. And it's in that moment that when things are difficult, they continue to find ways to show up. And I think that that's something that all of us can take away from all of these episodes for season 2 and season 1. You should go back and listen to that as well.
Yes,
Malcolm
awesome.
Gladwell was the host of season 1. And there were some things that I learned that I'm like, oh my God, like this is incredible. That one from, somebody who, joined the military, that is an immigrant and was a Holocaust survivor and was saved by the American military, and then made a promise to come to the United States and to serve in the military, and then goes on and becomes a Medal of Honor recipient, to Henry Johnson out of Albany, New York, that was, a Black soldier that barely joined because he just made the height requirement. I mean, 5'4", and this guy goes and does this heroic act. To Mary Walker, there's all these individuals over the course of our history, but these people just kept finding ways to show up, Jim.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that we can all learn and implement, that simple strategy to our personal lives as we navigate the things we navigate. Is just keep showing up. When things get difficult, you gotta find ways to keep showing up.
JR, I'm raising 2 boys, and I tell them all the time, when your friends are struggling, you just got to show up. And they're like, what do I say? Well, how do I'm like, don't worry about that. Because that was the key. Like, and again, I spent over a year of my life underwater, and I was thinking about this. When I talked to my shipmates, when we got out of the service, it was hard for us because in the Navy or in any branch of the military, my dad was a Ranger in Korea. My dad and I talked about this. The person on your left, the person on your right, All they're concerned about is keeping you alive and keeping themselves alive. And when you
Yeah.
get into the civilian world and the civilian workforce, suddenly everybody's got an agenda. Everybody's doing different angles. The idea of esprit de corps and I'm going to focus on what's best for you as much as me, it doesn't exist. And it's hard to adapt to that and to be reminded that there's men and women like this that have done so much and just average people who are in the moment and did that. This is a powerful message that I think a lot of people need to listen to, especially if you're in management.
100%. And I think you start to see those same cycles, right, repeat themselves,
Yeah.
unfortunately, when you talk about Henry Johnson, who, as a black man serving in the military, and unfortunately the way he was treated, and then he comes home and unfortunately he passes away 9 years after he receives the Medal of Honor. And it was simply because of a weak heart. That was it. That's a broken heart. That's a man that was essentially the nation kind of turned their back on him. And to some degree, you see a little bit of like repeat of those patterns, right? In the last, couple of decades, in the recent conflicts of Afghanistan and Iraq, you hear these stories of service members that come home and they're struggling. They're struggling. They're struggling to lean into vulnerability. They're struggling to find a community. They're struggling to find purpose. And I think a part of that is because we have to recalibrate what strength really means. And we have to really encourage our service members to lean into that vulnerability and to just show up and to find the people in their community that they can lean on and they can talk to and ultimately start that healing process. And I think that's what you need to see more of. And you hear these stories, and I think there's a lot of them that I've heard that to some degree, I'm like, I feel like I've heard this story before. Like it just feels like there's another story of a guy or a woman that in a moment of challenges just says, the hell with it, here I go. And that is something that to me, man, it's been such a beautiful opportunity for me this is my way of continuing to serve by telling these stories, reading these stories. And I'm not just reading it, I'm trying to really allow the listener to understand the situation and put them there. And this is where a little bit of that acting comes into play, where I'm trying to tell a story and I'm trying to give people the emotion of everything that was transpiring in this particular person's life, so they could be there, they could feel it. But I mean, the crew, I mean, the team behind this Medal of Honor Stories of Courage podcast, from the writer to the executive producer to everybody that does all the fact checking and everything that goes along with that, is incredible. I mean, it's 30 something pages each episode that ends up being around 30 to 40 minutes of a podcast episode. But we pack a lot in.
You do. And I've already listened to the first episode, JR, and I want to invite you to Detroit. We do I Thank You Fridays here on the morning show that I host. We feature a veteran every Friday just to say I thank you in some small way. And then we do a luncheon every year that start off with 3 people. And now we have a whole Detroit-style pizza restaurant full of veterans from World War II all the way through Iraq and Afghanistan.
I'm in.
And let's figure it out. You need to come to the Motor City, JR.
I'm in, baby. Let's do it. You sold me, right? The opportunity to be around some vets and hear some stories and pizza. I'm in, baby.
It's the easiest sell I've ever had to do in my life. Like Detroit style pizza and veterans hanging out. Keep doing what you're doing. It matters, JR. It matters. As a veteran, I can tell you it matters. There are men and women. I've lost shipmates to suicide and being unable to deal with this, and we weren't aware of what they were going through. And these stories remind you that you're not alone, that you can keep moving forward. And it honestly matters what you're doing. This resonates with, I hope you understand that there's a lot of men and women listening to this right now and listen to your podcast that get it and appreciate your story and your continued growth in what you do.
Well, Jim, thank you for that. But I want to say it's a team effort, my friend. And so for you having me on today and sharing your platform, with me and our audience of Medal of Honor Stories of Courage, that's what it's about, man. And so I really appreciate your effort and your time today. And I will definitely come up to Detroit.
So the guy who runs Buddy's Pizza, the originators of Detroit style pizza, he's an Air Force vet.
And right when I was going to make a joke about the Air Force, I was going to make a joke about the Air Force. Now I got to lay off because, I don't want to make him upset because I want to try that pizza. I don't want him to hold out.
Well, now that he's cooking pizza, he went from a desk job in the Air Force to like doing something, right? See, I said it for you. There we go.
So he's actually working now.
I like you. JR Martinez, it's an honor. Medal of Honor, Stories of Courage. Check out this podcast every week, and you are always welcome here at CSX and in the Motor City. You know that.
Hey, appreciate that, Jim. Have a great day, man.